Hi, I'm Dan Liebel, a senior consultant with Stone Ridge Software. I'm covering Introduction to Management Reporter. This is about columns part 2. So with the column type, as we go down the list, you have different options here, and based on what you select for column type, you'll have different options for your book code attribute category. So they kind of work together somewhat. With regards to description or calculation, you don't have anything below that. If you open up for your options on column type, these are what you can select from. FD or the amounts from financial dimensions, calc or calculated column, description or your row descriptions, and attributes are the ones that are most common. The top three, the FD, calc, and description, are the ones that are most prevalent. So let's talk. I wanted to keep that description. Otherwise, we won't know what the row represents, or we won't show the row. So if we select FD, that's your link to financial dimensions or your data from your data mart. So we'll cover that in a little bit. And calc is a calculation. So if you're doing a variance calculation or a percentage calculation, you need to reflect that. So if it's a percentage, it will look very much like this. So it's B divided by base row, which means it's dividing the numbers in column B, or our financial dimension row, and dividing it by our base row, which I'm going to believe is sales in this case, or net sales. And so net sales is 100%, and everything else is a percentage based on that, or in comparison to that number. So if we select FD, that's going to be a financial dimension or data from our data mart, which was stored. So it could either be actual numbers or it could be a budgetary information, and that's selected in your book code attribute category as I segue to that. So if we select FD, then we have actual, or we have a listing of all of the budgets that we have in the system. So the bottom is our budgets that we have in our Contoso environment. So you can either select actual or the budget. If you would select attributes, so if we would open up, if we had attribute, then we would have different selections in this button if we select attributes. So it would be all the different fields that you would be able to pull into that specific, for that specific column. Let's go back to our one here, and our periodic year-to-date column. The actual, let's get down to the fiscal year. So that's about enough on book code attribute category. You just select whether you want actual or a budgetary information in that. Now that we've defined that we want actual numbers, then we have to define what year do we want to pull them from. So we could do base year, which is going to be based on your report date. So if I am running a report as of 2017, the FD is going to be looking in my 2017 fiscal year. If I click on the drop down, I can select a couple different options here. I could enter the fiscal year. I wouldn't recommend that. In some cases it may make sense, but what that does is it creates some overhead where every time that number is not correct and you have to go into the column and manually change that number. It's better to do base, plus or minus, or base, one of those three options in order to define what period you want it to show or what year you want it to show. Or in this case it would be year. So base plus is going to be rarely used because that would be into the future, and generally you don't know those numbers other than maybe a budgetary number. Base minus could be, the base minus is going to be, base minus 1 would be last year, base minus 2 would be 2 years ago, base minus 3 years ago, etc. And so that will cover your fiscal year. So generally it's going to be base or base minus 1 are generally what I've seen. I imagine there are base minus 2 or 3s if you're comparing a couple years ago or 3 years ago, just to get a comparable year. With regards to period, it's going to be similar to the fiscal year where you have base. You have a bunch of different options under base, I guess, for period, because you can do base or base plus or base minus, which are most common, but you can also do number of periods before base period, number of periods after base period. If you're thinking of a rolling um, a rolling 12 month, for example, you could utilize those as base periods, base number of periods before base period. So you can also do a range of periods. Maybe you're going to do like, if you, maybe you always have a first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. You could do 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12 if you wanted to do quarterly statements, for example. So um, use your imagination. You can. There's a lot of different options there as far as that. Then periods covered. Um, you can do year to date or periodic as the primary ones. The slash BB is for beginning balance, and those aren't used very often. I've seen the year to date. The beginning balance ones are used on a cash flow, but other than that, you probably wouldn't use them very often. But the periodic is going to be just a period. So so based on the selection you did right above that, or the fiscal year, it's going to be grabbing that base period information or the base -1 period information. Same with the year to date. It's going to be looking at that fiscal year number and whether you want the year to date for last year or this year. That's all it's going to define what you're grabbing for numbers. The formula is a self-explanatory field. It's going to be the formula that you're using. So for generally they're fairly simple, like B divided by base row, for the CBR or for the percentage calculation if you want to do a percent of sales. It could also be a variance where you're subtracting, for example, if I had a budget column in column C and this calculation was in column D, then I would be doing, C minus B to get, or B minus C to see my comparison versus budget. The column width, by default, it will do auto fit as it shows in the description, but you can also define the numbers. Maybe you're a smaller company that don't need billions of dollars. You just do millions of dollars. So you can squeeze those columns together and it might allow you to fit more columns onto a report. So think of it that way. There are other ways to define, how much you can fit on a report. You can shrink to fit, so to speak, when we get to the report definition part of the training. But as a rule, you can define the length of your column. So in percentages, I don't need more than 10, and that leaves a little bit of space. So you can count out the number of digits that you need, and then that will so you can define it that way. So you can have some controls. And maybe on a balance sheet where you just have a description and a number, you don't need it all on the left side of the page. You can kind of create some space and space it out so it looks neat and presents well. The format currency override, again, isn't used very often, but on percentages you generally want to define how you want your percentages to present. So that's where that would come into play. So if you hit the drop down here, you can define the percentage, or in this case, there's a custom one created. The print control is another field that's used on I know for sure on cash flow statements you'd want to do it because you have to calculate your variance difference. So you would have two rows that would be non-printing and you just print one row that would be the numbers for your cash flow, or maybe you'd have two if you want to have a last year in there as well. A number of these other ones aren't used very often. The dimension filter is one I'll bring up as well. It can be used to, if you're doing departmental expenses, so maybe you have the same thing on every column, but you want to do one department per column. So then you would have operations and then sales, accounting, admin, HR, IT, for example. Maybe you have a different column for each dimension. So you would click on the cell and you would just select which department that you wanted to pull. So in this one it would be operations. So then that one's going to just filter just to the operations department, for example, is how that would work. The only other one that I'm going to bring up is the attribute filter, and that's if we're using the attributes. So if we would close this down, have the attributes open. So if you wanted to do an attribute filter, so you could put in a date filter here because this is a transaction date. So maybe you just put in whatever that filter that you would need to utilize to just show certain dates. So maybe you only want to show December or January, just one month at a time.